On behalf of Crossroads Cultural Center, my name is Angelo Matera. I'm a member of the Crossroads Advisory Board. Tonight's session is called The Rise of the Technocratic Society. It needs very little introduction, I'm sure. I guess how you can describe the Technocratic Society is a society where technology driven by data is the basis for improving life in society. We all benefit from this. We all are consumed by it. I use one aspect of this, the Waze app, in order to control my reality today and get here just in the nick of time to be able to squeeze as much out of my time rather than leaving early. So, it gives us a lot of control, but as I just described, it also causes problems. This was encapsulated very well by former editor of the New Republic, Leon Wieseltier. I'd like to quote him here where he said, "Where wisdom once was, quantification will now be. Quantification is the most overwhelming influence upon the contemporary American understanding of, well, everything. The notion that the non-material dimensions of life must be explained in terms of the material dimensions, and that non-scientific understandings must be translated into scientific understandings if they are to qualify as knowledge, is increasingly popular. The contrary insistence that the glories of art and thought are not evolutionary adaptations, or that the mind is not the brain, or that love is not just biology's bait for sex, now amounts to a kind of heresy." So the great flaw of this technology, data-obsessed scientism, as it's been called, is that it is itself not science, but a reductionist philosophy that reduces reality to what is measurable or useful. So accordingly, today, our debates about the limitations, even our debates about the limitations of this quantitative approach to everything, are usually conducted in sociological or utilitarian terms. In this way, we never escape from what Pope Benedict XVI called the bunker of positivism. As a first step towards the open air of reality, it is very important that we diagnose clearly the philosophical and historical roots of this technocratic mindset. And for this purpose, we're fortunate tonight to have Professor Michael HANBY and Professor Carlo Ancelotti. Here's some biographical information about both of them. Michael HANBY is Assistant Professor of Science and Culture at the John Paul II Institute for Studies of Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America, where he teaches primarily in the theology, biotechnology, and bioethics specialization. Prior to that, he taught at Baylor University and Villanova University. He's currently working on a book about the doctrine of creation and critical engagement with the Darwinian tradition of evolutionary biology. Has that come out already?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just
okay,
like
I think
my profile.
Right. No God, no science.
Right.
Okay. He's author of Augustine and Modernity, as well as a book, and as well as articles, many articles in Communio, Modern Theology, Theology Today, Pro Ecclesia, and New Blackbriars. Professor HANBY and his wife Stephanie have 2 young children and live in Hyattsville, Maryland. Carlo Ancelotti was born in Milan, Italy, and moved to the US in 1990 to pursue his doctoral degree in applied mathematics at the University of Virginia. He is currently a professor of mathematics and a member of the graduate faculty in physics at the City University of New York, College of Staten Island. His field of scholarship is mathematical physics, with a special emphasis on the kinetic theory of plasmas and gravitating theory. He recently translated into English a collection of essays by Augusto del Noce, which was published by McGill Queen's University Press with the title, The Crisis of Modernity. It's available here for sale. The late del Noce is one of the most original European critics of the Technocratic or Technological Society. Carlo is also a co-founder of Crossroads. We will begin with Michael HANBY. Give him a hand.
Thank you all very much. It's great to be here. I'm going to try, I teach to a room this size without a microphone, so I'm going to try without it unless anyone has difficulty now hearing me, or unless it messes up a recording. Okay, well, it's great to be here. I want to thank all of the people associated with Crossroads, and especially my good friend Carlo Ancelotti for inviting me, in spite of our long and amicable disagreement over certain aspects of my argument. This is, I believe, my third Crossroads event, if you count the New York encounter. And though it seems to be my designated role in these things to be the bearer of bad news, it's always a profoundly stimulating and deeply enjoyable experience, at least for me. Our subject tonight, about which I suspect we up here mostly disagree, is one of perennial interest. Technocratic society is the milieu in which we now live and move and have our being. And it underlies, albeit in different ways, the myriad crises and issues that dominate contemporary life. From the ecological crisis to the radical transformation of civil society in the public square, to the latest wave of the sexual revolution and its profound reconfiguration of basic human realities. And it's particularly timely at this moment after Pope Francis's strong and quite surprising critique of what he calls the technocratic paradigm in his new encyclical Laudato Si. I don't have a great deal to say about the encyclical, as I'd actually prefer to think about it first. But I hope that what I do have to say can at least indirectly cast some light on the Pope's important argument. In order to understand the technocratic society, we have to think as deeply as possible first about the meaning of technology, and second about what it means that our society is organized in some fundamental way by it and around it. That's more than I can accomplish in 20 minutes, but at least in order to gesture toward this task, I want to begin with the observation of a fact so obvious, it seems, that it mostly escapes our notice. And this is the curious fact that there is simply no such thing as a profound question in American public life. By that, I do not mean that Americans as a people are incapable of profundity, or that there are no profound works to be found in American arts and letters. Rather, I mean that the profound question is simply not a category employed or recognized by American public reason, and that Americans do not generally encounter or engage reality through the lens of profound questions, which presupposes that reality itself is a mystery with depths to be plumbed. Rather, we encounter the world first and foremost as a set of problems, which exercises a powerful influence over the subsequent form of our thinking, eliciting a response in the form of technical, political, or managerial solutions. This curious fact has enormous implications, and it indicates something of what I do and do not mean by technology in technocratic society. By technology, I do not merely mean iPhones and such, as if technology were just a collection of devices. Technology, in the sense I'm using it, is not principally a set of neutral instruments that could be used well or badly, though of course it is also that. And it's clear, for instance, that our enslavement to these devices accelerates the growth of a pervasive thoughtlessness inimical to our freedom. Neither is technological society identical to the fact that our public life is increasingly carried out on Twitter, which substitutes witticisms for the more elaborate forms of sophistry which used to characterize public discourse. I do not mean the ideology of scientism or the blind faith that many of our contemporaries place in technology or in technical expertise to solve the aforementioned problems. Nor do I mean the awe-inspiring power of social media to manufacture public consensus and to impose it upon private individuals and public institutions. All of these things are extremely important, and together they indicate something fundamental about the nature of our society that I hope to illuminate. But I regard them as manifestations of a more basic sense of technology and the concern indicated or implicit in my opening observation. And that is the radical transformation that has taken place over the last few centuries in what it now means for us to think, and what we think there is to think about, and in the meaning of truth itself. Transformations which propel us toward a distinct though uncertain kind of destiny. The nature of this transformation is indicated by that very modern word, technology, which fuses techne and logos, making and knowing. Hans Jonas makes the important point that as a way of regarding the world, technology has been endemic to modern science and the scientific conception of nature since its origins in the 17th century and precedes any real technological products, the more ordinary instrumental sense of technology, generated by the new science. This fusion supersedes the old distinction between contemplation and action, effectively bringing the former to an end by subordinating it and refashioning it in the image of the latter. This new technological manner of knowing is a knowing by doing, which, quote, takes experience apart and analyzes it, end quote, in the words of Francis Bacon. That is, it destroys in thought and experiment the unity of experience and the intelligible wholes which comprise it, in order to reduce these objects to their simplest components and reconstruct them as the sum of those abstract components and their interactions. This is the meaning of that famous Baconian phrase, knowledge is power. It's not simply that we know for the sake of control, as if every scientist were Goethe's Wagner cooking up homunculus in his basement. It's rather that we know by means of the various kinds of control that we're able to exercise over the phenomena of nature. And the truth of our knowledge is measured by the success of our experiments in predicting, retrodicting, or manipulating these phenomena. I think this is what Pope Francis means in Laudato Si 106 when he says, quote, that the scientific and experimental method is already a technique of possession, mastery, and transformation, end quote. This is not principally a matter of subjective will or intention or even nefarious ends. Rather, it is inherent in the structure of scientific cognition and experimental rationality. I'd like to call your attention to three implications of this. First, the subjective conflation of knowing and making has as its ontological counterpart the objective conflation of nature and artifice. Whereas for Aristotle and the tradition, art imitated nature, which meant that natural things had a unity and an interiority that artifacts lacked. Beginning in the 17th century, nature itself is reconceived as artifice. The ontological identity of each thing becomes precisely identical to its causal history and to the organized interaction of its parts. And the indivisible unity, eminence, interiority, the being in itselfness, which heretofore distinguished natural things from artifacts, becomes invisible to the eyes of scientific reason. This comes very close to the characterization of the technological mind which Francis takes from Guardini. The technological mind, quote, sees nature as an insensate order, as a cold body of facts, as a mere given, as an object of utility, as raw material to be hammered into useful shape. The Pope roots the technological mind in disordered affections, the desire to become lords and masters of nature. And this is, of course, a very traditional diagnosis, perhaps even the deepest one. But without further development, it would leave us with a merely moralistic critique of the subjective motivations or sincerity of scientists, not an ontological critique of the structure of reason or the nature of things. And it is, after all, the truth of nature that is in question. Affection always entails judgments, and the judgment of nature as artificial or plastic is implicit in the structure of controlling reason, even where one's subjective motivations are noble or sincere. This partly explains the disappearance of contemplative reason, and ultimately the absence of profound questions in our public life. The conflation of nature and art leaves us with no depths to contemplate, only facts to analyze and synthesize. Second, the conflations of nature and art, contemplation and action, bring about a radical transformation in the very meaning of truth. Joseph Ratzinger tracks this transformation in Introduction to Christianity as a movement from truth as being, virum est ens, to truth as the made, virum quia factum, to truth as the makeable or the feasible, virum quia faciendum. Francis Bacon openly advocated this in equating truth with utility and proposing to measure truth by its products. Quote, what is most useful in operating is truest in knowing, he writes. But it was the intellectual godfather of American progressivism, John Dewey, attempting to do away with traditional philosophy once and for all, and to institutionalize the pursuit of technological progress as the modus vivendi of American life, who perhaps best articulated this Baconian point of view. He says things are what they can do and what can be done with them. Third, If nature is merely artifice, then this means that knowledge of nature is essentially engineering, and that the truth of nature is whatever simply is technically possible, which can only be ascertained by perpetually transgressing the present limits of possibility. Indeed, if nature or natural just means possible, then it's the exceptions which reveal what's possible that define the norm. And this is so much the case across a variety of areas that I'm tempted to call it the defining sort of formal feature of modern thought. The so-called technological imperative that what can be done must be done is thus built into our very notions of reason and of nature and of truth, which is why moralistic objections to it have mostly proven to be impotent. To abandon the technological imperative, it seems to us, is to forsake reason itself. In its optimistic guise, this perpetual war against the limits, the given limits of possibility, goes by the name of progress. And it would be foolish to deny the innumerable benefits which it has bequeathed to us. I mean, we're in New York after all, which is breathtaking. This seems as good a time as any to anticipate the inevitable objection and to say that the point here is not to deny these benefits or to oppose science and technology. If technology bears the necessity that I am ascribing to it, this would be a bit like opposing air. The point, rather, is to understand it. And if we remove the happy face from progress and view it more critically, we begin to understand an additional dimension of technology diagnosed by the likes of Jonas, George Grant, and Hannah Arendt, namely technology as fate. Though this does not negate the contingency of history or require any particular consequence as a matter of mechanical necessity. Pope Francis notes this paradox in Laudato Si 105. In this sense, he writes, "We stand naked and exposed in the face of our ever-increasing power, lacking the wherewithal to control it," end quote. Why so? The absolutizing of possibility and this war against limits sets in motion an interminable historical dynamism to which we are necessarily responsive. As Hans Jonas says, control, by making ever more things available to more kinds of uses, enmeshes the user's life in ever more dependencies on external objects. There is no other way of exercising the power than by making oneself available to the use of things as they become available. Tasks for theory are thus set by the practical results of its preceding use, their solutions to be turned again to use, and so on and so on. With the collapse of nature into artifice, the ontological and technical order, the realm of the born and the realm of the made, have fused for us, setting in motion an interminable dynamic process that shapes in advance the form of our response to it and places our thinking under the dominion of a perpetual emergency. Let me point out a few examples from among the innumerable contemporary instances. The circumstances that make the precise definition of life and death so urgent are themselves technologically generated. The need to identify and isolate an analytically discrete moment of conception, accurate to the fraction of a second, from a continuum of events that includes the conjugal embrace of man and woman, the new embryo's step-by-step integration of its genomic inheritance, his further development, and his eventual birth, would not recommend itself to us were it not for our ability to dissociate, analyze, intervene, and manipulate the various stages of this process. Likewise, the need to precisely define death in order to identify it within an instance of its occurring would not be so urgent were it not for our ability to prolong life artificially and to harvest organs, and if extraordinary cost did not accompany extraordinary measures. The legal and political battles over the redefinition of marriage similarly presupposes the technological conquest of reproductive biology, without which same-sex marriage would have remained permanently unthinkable. Or take our recent national celebration of Caitlyn Jenner. This could not have occurred before the 1970s because Bruce's true self was technologically impossible. As political philosophy always presupposes natural philosophy, so this artificial nature, this techno-ontological order, if you will, is more basic than our political order. Here, then, we may venture a kind of definition, a provisional definition, and a sort of working definition that's imperfect, of technocracy. A technocratic society is one whose basic conception of reason and reality are themselves technological. A society which is therefore governed more deeply by the dynamic exigencies of technological order and technological production than by the rule of law, which is mostly responsive to those exigencies. To illustrate this point, let me give one last example. I've already referred to the power of social media to manufacture and police public consensus. Indeed, you hardly need a Stasi when you have a neighbor with an iPhone. You can end up on YouTube and as the brunt of the world's anger in an instance with one unguarded word. That's the world we live in. We saw an astonishing and a rather frightening display of this in the aftermath of Indiana's RFRA legislation, when the full brunt of this power was brought to bear on private individuals and public institutions, prior to and outside of any decision of the law. In fact, it's unclear what protections, if any, the courts could have provided such a notion, which could have provided against such action had they been inclined to do so, which of course they're not. A thoroughly technocratic society would perfect absolutism in Hannah Arendt's sense, not as the rule of one, exemplified by the tyrant who controls the levers of states and consolidates all power in his person, but rather as the rule of nobody, not to be confused with the absence of rule. The mindless, algorithmic rule of a complex adaptive system with no outer horizon, no controlling center, no levers to pull, and therefore no responsible parties. A rule whose institutional form is bureaucracy and whose social form is arguably the Twitterverse. The paradox of technocracy is that an interminable dynamism set in motion by our freedom perpetually threatens to overwhelm it. Pope Francis seems to recognize this paradox. Our freedom fades, he writes, when it is handed over to the blind forces of the unconscious, of immediate needs, of self-interest, and of violence. End quote. What it means now, and what it means in this emerging order, which has been a long time coming, what it means to preserve our freedom is an urgent and very difficult question, insofar as technology is a kind of fate for us, and insofar as fate implies a certain difficulty, even incapacity to act with real effect. Two things nevertheless seem clear in closing. Insofar as the absolutism of technocracy depends on replacing truth with function, or reducing truth to function, what things are with how they work, there can hardly be a greater threat to our freedom than the pervasive thoughtlessness produced by the technocratic paradigm, which subordinates the consideration of truth to the exigencies of action, and thereby prevents us from saying or even thinking coherently about what things are. And conversely, if we wish to preserve our freedom, we must fight for the capacity to see and to think beyond the technological paradigm and its necessities, to recover the priority of contemplation to action and the unity of freedom and truth. Indeed, the less our capacity for effective action, the more important our capacity for understanding becomes. And in fact, this is proper, for the Christian faith has always held that we remain free so long as we can see the truth, because we can always make a gift of our fate by suffering in witness to it. It has happened more than once in Western and Christian history that truth has overcome the seemingly inexorable force of fate. And so we may still dare to hope, even within technocratic order, that the truth will set us free. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Michael.
As Angelo kind of hinted, I'm not here because of my professional expertise, but as a translator, because I had the opportunity to translate this Italian author, whom I think is a passion of mine, but I think the reason I translated him is because I think that he brings a perspective that to some degree is missing in the American discourse about secularization, about the technocratic society. And so I will start just by saying a few words about who this guy was, because then what I'm going to say is mostly stolen from him. And I'm here to channel Professor Del Noce. Anyway, and he was a young philosopher who in the 1930s had to fight fascism. He was an anti-fascist, and then he had this major trauma because during the Second World War, he was a pacifist. He suddenly, the communists who were the anti-fascists were just as violent as the fascists. Okay? And so he found this existential quandary in which he seen that violence was winning on each side. And after the war, he found himself facing the question of how to resist communism. And then in the early 60s, Del Noce noticed that something was changing. It was the time where all over Europe there was what Gramsci called the hegemony. You know, the Marxist culture was dominant in the academia, in the press, in the arts, in literature. At the same time, in the late 50s, early 60s, Del Noce realized that a new culture was being formed. And he tried to capture it to describe what this culture was. And this culture, in many ways, was exactly what Michael was describing. But Del Noce caught this very early, because at that time, everybody thought that the problem was the Soviet Union, was Marxist, was the height of the Cold War. And as early as 1963, Del Noce understood that Marxism was finished, essentially. It was finished not because it was not dominant at all levels of society and culture, but because philosophically, it had been defeated by another way of thinking. Because what he noticed is that even Marxists started to think along different lines. And the first way he described this is that society more and more focus on the distinction between what is verifiable by everyone and what is not verifiable by everyone. Where the word is by everyone. By everyone means that, say, religion or personal deep reflection or a lifetime of experience is irrelevant, or profound questions, as Michael said, is ultimately irrelevant to public discourse, is irrelevant to our communal life, because it's not verifiable by everyone. And then, investigating this idea that society was moving in this technocratic, data-oriented direction, an empiricist direction, he realized that what was coming back was positivism. Positivism was this school of thought from the 19th century that affirmed that there is no ideal dimension, there is just facts, brute facts, that things are. My example I give to my children about positivism is that if you get a package of chocolates, you ask, who sent it to me? You say, the postman. You know what I mean? In the sense that there is no question that somebody loves you and that the box of chocolate is a sign of love. No, there is just the fact that this morning the postman at 9:38 delivered the chocolate. Okay? So this is positivism for the masses. So he realized that this was coming back and that the suppression of this any ideal dimension was created into a society which gave a total primacy of action over contemplation. That's a word that Michael used. Why? Because if there is no ideal dimension, it is just facts, all you can do is to manipulate the facts. Right? So life is about manipulating facts. And you also realize that this has deep implications about knowledge. Because now, knowledge is knowledge to manipulate the facts. Okay? Knowledge is no longer knowledge to contemplate, is no longer knowledge to know, is knowledge to do. I see this in my school children sometimes. You don't learn to know. You learn to do, to make, to change, to manipulate. Okay? So I saw this pervasive culture already in the 1960s. And to describe it, he went back to a category that was defined by the great German philosopher Max Scheler in the 1920s. In the 1920s, Scheler said that at that time, in the 20s, there was still fight in the European civilization between two ideas of man, Homo sapiens and Homo faber, the man who knows and the man who does. And in the 1960s, Del Noce realized that this fight was over, in a sense, that Homo faber had won above Homo sapiens, and so that knowledge was ultimately instrumental. Okay? That basically European culture had embraced an instrumentalist idea of knowledge. Knowledge is not to know the truth, is not to ask profound questions, but knowledge is to manipulate, to dominate reality. So I think all of this is kind of along the lines of what Michael was talking about, so I'm going to be very brief. and it's not particularly original, if you wish, because many other people realized that, but I think that Del Noce then made 3 points that I found original, that's part of the reason why I translated the book. Okay, so I'm going to talk about these 3 points, and I hope I have enough time. The first point is that Del Noce was very keen on understanding the source of this change, how this new culture came about after World War II. Because you see, some people give a pure sociological explanation. We have TVs, we have cars, we have more technology, and then technology shapes our way of thinking. Okay? Since technology is advancing so much, we think technology. Del Noce disagreed. Del Noce thought that human beings are symbolic animals. Human beings don't take a breath without having a notion of who they are and what